my dear friends, and welcome to episode 4 on Wicca. Super interesting how much, heavy, in-depth information there is in this Wikipedia article. I think it goes to show how much research there has been, especially given that this is a modern religion. So, I think in the future, when we have a big topic like a religion to discuss, I think that you should expect an almost video series about it. Now, let's move on to covens. By the way, just before we begin, if you have anything that you want me to read about, tell me in the comments and I will read about it. Now, lineaged Wicca is organised into covens of initiated priests and priestesses. Covens are autonomous and generally headed by a high priest and a high priestess working in partnership, being a couple who have each been through their first, second and third degrees of initiation. Occasionally, the leaders of a coven are only second degree initiates, in which case they come under the rule of the parent coven. Initiation and training of new priesthood is most often performed within a coven environment, but this is not a necessity, and few initiated Wiccans are unaffiliated with any coven. Most covens would not admit members under the age of 18. They often do not advertise their existence, and when they do so through pagan magazines. Some organise courses and workshops through which prospective members can come along and be assessed. Interesting that they are kind of like this secret kind of group. It makes them more elusive, and also I bet it heightens people's want to be part of this kind of elusive elite secret group. I don't know if you can hear in the background, but there are some kookaburras outside laughing, if you know about the Australian kookaburra bird. Anyway, a commonly quoted Wiccan tradition holds that the ideal number of members for a coven is 13, though this is not held as a hard and fast rule. Indeed, many US covens are far smaller, though the membership may be augmented by unaffiliated Wiccans at open rituals. Pearson noted that covens typically contained between 5 and 10 initiates. They generally avoid mass recruitment due to the feasibility of finding spaces large enough to bring together great numbers for rituals, and because larger numbers inhibit the sense of intimacy and trust that covens utilize. Some covens are short-lived, but others have survived for many years. Covens in the reclaiming tradition are often single-sexed and non-hierarchical in structure. Coven members who leave their original group to form another separate coven are often described as having hived off in Wicca. Initiation into a coven is traditionally preceded by an apprenticeship period of a year and a day. A course of study may be set during this period. In some covens, a dedication ceremony may be performed during this period, sometime before the initiation proper, allowing the person to attend certain rituals on a probationary basis. Some solitary Wiccans also chose to study for a year and a day before their self-dedication to the religion. Various high priestesses and high priests have reported being put on a pedestal by new initiates, only to have those students later kick away the pedestal as they develop their own knowledge and experience of Wicca. Within a coven, different members may be respected for having particular knowledge of specific areas such as Kabbalah, astrology, or the tarot. Based on her experience among British traditional Wiccans in the UK, Pearson stated that the length of time between becoming a first-degree initiate and a second was typically 2 to 5 years. Some practitioners nevertheless chose to remain as first-degree initiates rather than proceed initiated in any tradition. A widening public appetite, especially in the United States, made traditional initiation unable to satisfy demand for involvement in Wicca. Since the 1970s, larger, more informal, often publicly advertised camps and workshops began to take place. This less formal but more accessible form of Wicca proved successful. Eclectic Wicca is the most popular variety of Wicca in America, and eclectics now significantly outnumber lineaged Wiccans. Eclectic Wicca is not necessarily the complete abandonment of tradition. Eclectic practitioners may follow their own individual ideas and ritual practices while still drawing on one or more religious or philosophical paths. Eclectic approaches to Wicca often draw on earth religion, ancient Egyptian, Greek, Saxon, Anglo-Saxon, Celtic, Asian, Jewish, and Polynesian traditions. In contrast to the British traditional Wiccans, reclaiming Wiccans, and various eclectic Wiccans, the sociologist Douglas Essie argued that there existed a popularized witchcraft that was driven primarily by consumerist marketing and is represented by movies, television shows, commercial magazines, and consumer goods. Books and magazines in this vein were targeted largely at young girls and included spells for attracting or repelling boyfriends, money, spells, and home protection spells. He termed this New Age witchcraft and compared individuals involved in this to participants in the New Age. Now we move to their section on the history of Wicca. We've probably read about a lot of this already, but I think this is a systematic view. We have a quote here by religious studies scholar Ethan Doyle White. Wicca originated in the early decades of the 20th century among those esoterically inclined Britons who wanted to resurrect the faith of their ancient forebears, and arose to public attention in the 1950s and 60s, largely due to a small band of dedicated followers who were insistent on presenting their faith to what at times was a very hostile world. From these humble beginnings, this radical religion spread to the United States, where it found a comfortable bedfellow in the form of the 1960s counterculture, and came to be championed by those sectors of the women's and gay liberation movements who were seeking a spiritual escape from Christian hegemony. Interesting, kind of like what I was talking about in one of the previous episodes about how if this is a reactionary religion, it would probably become a progressive movement, as it's reactionary from what is the commonplace. Now, Wicca was founded in England between 1921 and 1950, representing what the historian Ronald Hutton called the only full-form religion which England can be said to have given the world. Characterized as an invented tradition by scholars, Wicca was created from the patchwork adoption of various older elements, many taken from pre-existing religious and esoteric movements. Pearson characterized it as having arisen from the cultural impulses of the Fin de Siècle. Wicca took as its basis the witch cult hypothesis. This was the idea that those persecuted as witches during the early modern period in Europe were not, as the persecutors has claimed, followers of Satanism, nor were they innocent people who confessed to witchcraft under threat of torture, as having long been the historical consensus, but rather that they were adherents of a surviving pre-Christian pagan religion. Yeah, I can see why that would be a historical thing to adopt, but from almost everything that I've seen, it seems that the witch trials weren't about any hidden religion, but were mainly just a misogynistic, patriarchal kind of tool that just men would use against women they didn't like, against their wives, stuff like that, or people that were outcast and the town didn't like. It doesn't seem like there is much evidence from everything that I've seen that there was a counterculture, a cult or religion at the time. I have looked for this in the past, but there's always a possibility of something existing that I haven't heard about or that may not be recorded. Anyway, this theory had been first expressed by the German professor Karl Ernst Jacqui in 1828 before being endorsed by the German Franz Joseph Mon and then the French historian Jules Michelet. In the late 19th century, it was then adopted by two Americans, Matilda Jocelyn Gage and Charles Lalande, the latter of whom prompted a variant of it in his 1899 book, Aradia, or the Gospel of Witches, which we've talked about before. The theory's most prominent advocate was the English Egyptologist Margaret Murray, who promoted it in a series of books, most notably in the 1921s, The Witch's Cult in Western Europe, and the 1933s, The God of the Witches. Almost all of Murray's peers regarded the witch cult theory as incorrect and based on poor scholarship. However, Murray was invited to write the entry on witchcraft for the 1929 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica. Wow, a great honour, which was reprinted for decades and became so influential that, according to folklorist Jacqueline Simpson, Murray's ideas became so entrenched in popular culture that they will probably never be uprooted. But they're most likely incorrect. Simpson noted that the only contemporary member of the Folklore Society who took Murray's theory seriously was Gerald Gardner, who used it as the basis for his Wicca. Murray's books were the sources of many well-known motifs that had often been incorporated into Wicca. The idea that covens should have 13 members was developed by Murray based on a single witness statement from one of the witch trials, as was her assertion that covens met on the cross-quarter days 4 times per year. Murray was very interested in ascribing naturalistic or religious ceremonial explanations to some of the more fantastic descriptions found in witch trial testimony. Interesting, so it does seem that the historical lineages for the foundations of this are based on some pretty flimsy historical pretexts. For example, many of the confessions included the idea that Satan was personally present at coven meetings. Murray interpreted this as a witch priest wearing horns and animal skins, and a pair of forked boots to represent his authority or rank. Most mainstream folklorists, on the other hand, have argued that the entire scenario was always fictitious and does not require a naturalistic explanation. But Gardner enthusiastically adopted many of Murray's explanations into his own tradition. The witch cult theory represented the historical narrative around which Wicca built itself, with the early Wiccans claiming to be the survivors of this ancient pagan religion. Other influences upon early Wicca include various Western esoteric traditions and practices, among them ceremonial magic, Aleister Crowley and his religion of Thelema, Freemasonry, spiritualism and theosophy. To a lesser extent, Wicca also drew upon folk magic and the practices of cunning folk. It was further influenced both by scholarly works on folklorists, particularly James Fraser's The Golden Bowl, as well as Romanticist writings like Robert Graves' The White Goddess, and pre-existing modern pagan groups 1930s that the first evidence appears for the practice of pagan witchcraft religion, what would soon be recognisable now as Wicca, in England. It seems that several groups around the country in places such as Norfolk, Cheshire and the New Forest had set themselves up as continuing in the tradition of Murray's witch cult, albeit with influences coming from disparate sources such as ceremonial magic, folk magic, Freemasonry, Theosophy, Romanticism, Druidry, classical mythology and Asian religions. According to Gerald Gardner's account in Witchcraft Today, the meaning of witchcraft, Wicca, is the survival of a European witch cult that was persecuted during the witch trials. Theories of an organised pan-European witch cult, as well as mass trials thereof, have largely been discredited, but it is still common for Wiccans to claim solidarity with witch trial victims. The notion of the survival of Wiccan traditions and rituals from ancient sources is contested by most recent researchers, who suggest that Wicca is a 20th century creation which combines elements of Freemasonry and 19th century occultism. Historians such as Ronald Houghton have noted that Wicca predates the modern New Age movement and also differs markedly in its general philosophy. In his 1999 book, The Triumph of the Moon, Bristol University history professor Ronald Houghton researched the Wiccan claim that the ancient pagan customs have survived into modern times after being Christianized in medieval times as folk practices. Houghton found that most of the folk customs which are claimed to have pagan roots, such as the maypole dance, actually date from the Middle Ages. He concluded that the idea that medieval revels were pagan in origin is a legacy of the Protestant Reformation. Now, into early development. From 1936 to 1959, the history of Wicca states with Gerald Gardner, the father of Wicca in the mid-20th century. Gardner was a retired British civil servant and amateur anthropologist with broad familiarity in paganism and occultism. He claimed to have been initiated into a witch's coven in New Forest, Hampshire in the late 1930s. Intent on perpetuating this craft, Gardner founded the Bricket Wood Coven with his wife Donna in the 1940s after buying the Naturous 5 Acres Country Club. Much of the coven's early membership was drawn from the club's members, and its meetings were held in the club grounds. Many notable figures of early Wicca were direct initiates of this coven, including Dafoe, Doreen Valiente, Jack Brasselin, Frederick Lamond, Dionys, Eleanor Bone, and Louis Bourne. The witchcraft religion became more prominent beginning in 1951 with the repeal of the Witchcraft Act of 1735, after which Gerald Gardner and the others such as Charles Cardinal and Cecil Williamson began publicising their own versions of the craft. Gardner and others never used the term Wicca as a religious identifier, simply referring to the witch cult, witchcraft and the old religion. However, Gardner did refer to witches as the Wicca. During the 1960s, the name of the religion normalised to Wicca. Gardner's tradition, later termed Gardnerianism, soon became the dominant form in England and spread to other parts of the British Isles. And now we look at the adaptation and spread from 1960 to the present. Following Gardner's death in 1964, the craft continued to grow unabated despite sensationalism and negative portrayals in British tabloids, with new traditions being propagated by figures like Robert Cochrane, Sybil Leek, and most importantly Alex Sanders, whose Alexandrian Wicca, which was predominantly based upon Gardnerian Wicca, albeit with an emphasis placed on ceremonial magic, spread quickly and gained much media attention. Around this time, the term Wicca generation joined Wicca, who had been influenced by the counterculture of the 1960s. Many brought environmentalist ideas with them into the movement, as reflected by the formation of groups like the UK-based Pagans Against Nukes. In the US, Victor Anderson, Cora Anderson, and Gwydion Anderson established Fairy Wicca. It was in the United States and in Australia that new homegrown traditions, sometimes based upon earlier regional folk magic traditions, and often mixed with the basic structure of Gardnerian Wicca, began to develop, including Victor Anderson's fairy tradition, Joseph Wilson's 1734 tradition, Aidan Gillies' the New Reformed Orthodox Order of the Golden Dawn, and eventually Zeus Budapest Dianic Wicca, each of which emphasized different aspects of the faith. It was also around this time that the books teaching people how to become witches themselves without formal initiation or training began to emerge. Among them, Paul Huson's Mastering Witchcraft in 1970 and Lady Shiver's Book of Shadows in 1971. Similar books continued to be published throughout the 1980s and 1990s, fueled by the writings of such authors as Doreen Valiente, Janet Farrar, Stuart Farrar, and Scott Cunningham, who popularised the idea of self-initiation into the craft. Among witches in Canada, anthropologist Dr. Heather Botting Neharden of the University of Victoria has been one of the most prominent, having been the first recognised Wiccan chaplain of a public university. She is the original High Priestess of Coven Celeste. In the 1990s, amid ever-rising numbers of self-initiates, the popular media began to explore witchcraft in the fictional films like The Craft in 1996, and television series like Charmed from 1998 to 2006, introducing numbers of young people to the idea of religious witchcraft. This growing demographic was soon catered to through the internet and by authors like Silver Ravenwolf, much to the criticism of traditional Wiccan groups and individuals. In response to the way that Wicca was increasingly portrayed as trendy, eclectic, and influenced by the New Age movement, many witches turned to the pre-Gardnerian origins of the craft and to the traditions of its rivals like Cardell and Cochrane, describing themselves as following traditional witchcraft. Prominent groups within this traditional witchcraft revival include Andrew Jumbley's Cultus Sabati and the Cornish Ross and Booker Coven. Now, let's go to demographics. It would be interesting to see how popular it is. Okay, of course, originating in Britain, Wicca then spread to North America, Australasia, which is Australia and the area around it, continental Europe, and South Africa. The actual number of Wiccans worldwide is unknown, and it has been noted that it is more difficult to establish the numbers of members of neo-pagan faiths than many other religions due to their disorganized structure. However, adherence.com, an independent website which specializes in collecting estimates of world religions, cites over 30 sources with estimate numbers of Wiccans, principally from the USA and UK. From this, they developed a median estimate of 800,000 members. That's actually quite a lot. As of 2016, Doyle White suggests that there were hundreds of thousands of practicing Wiccans around the globe. In 1998, the Wiccan High Priestess and academic psychologist Vivienne Crowley suggested that Wicca had been less successful in propagating in countries whose populations were primarily Roman Catholic. She suggested that this might be because Wicca's emphasis on a female divinity was more novel to people raised in Protestant-dominant backgrounds on the basis of her experience choices about their religious identity when they are old enough. From her field work among members of the reclaiming tradition in California during 1980 to 90, the anthropologist Joan Salomonson found that many described joining the movement following an extraordinary experience of revelation. Based on their analysis of internal trends, the sociologist of religion Douglas Essie and Helen Berger argued that by 2009, the phenomenal growth that Wicca has experienced in preceding years had slowed. Now let's talk about Wicca in Europe. Leo Rubicki in 2004 says, "The average Wiccan is a man in his 40s or a woman in her 30s. Caucasian, reasonably well educated, not earning much, probably not too concerned about material things, someone that demographers would call lower middle class." From her 1996 survey of British Wiccans, Pearson found that most Wiccans were aged between 25 and 45, with the average age being around 35. She noted that as the Wiccan community aged, so the proportion of older practitioners would increase. She found roughly equal proportions of men and women, and found that 62% were from Protestant backgrounds, which was consistent with the dominance of Protestantism in Britain at large. Pearson's survey also found that half of British Wiccans featured had a university education and that they tended to work in healing professions like medicine or counselling, education, computing and administration. She noted that there was thus a certain homogeneity about the background of British Wiccans. In the United Kingdom, census figures on religion were first collected in 2001. No detailed statistics were reported outside of the 6 main religions. For the 2011 census, a more detailed breakdown of responses were reported, with 56,620 people identifying themselves as pagans, 11,766 as Wiccans, and further 1,276 describing their religion as witchcraft. Now moving to North America. In the United States, the American Religious Identification Survey had shown significant increases in the number of self-identified Wiccans, from 8,000 in 1990 to 134,000 in 2001 and 342,000 in 2008. Wiccans have also made up significant proportions of various groups within that country. For instance, Wicca is the largest non-Christian faith practiced in the United States Air Force, with 1,434 airmen identifying themselves as such. In 2014, the Pew Research Center estimated that 0.3% of the US population, which is 950,000 people, identified as Wicca, based on a sample size of 35,000. That's a lot. That's a dang lot. Now we look at the acceptance of Wiccans. Now, it starts with a little thing saying that the use of the inverted pentagram by the Church of Satan has contributed to the misidentification of Wiccans as Satanists. But the pentagram, like a normal pentagram, not inverted, is where the middle star goes up at the top, whereas the inverted one, there are 2 stars and a gap at the top, and the main star point goes down. So yeah, normal 1 point, inverted point. That's how you tell the difference. Wicca emerged in predominantly Christian England, and from its inception the religion encountered opposition from certain Christian groups, as well as from the popular tabloids like the News of the World. Some Christians still believe that Wicca is a form of Satanism, despite important differences between these 2 religions. closet. That's great. Attitudes to Christianity vary within the Wiccan movement, stretching from outright rejection to a willingness to work alongside Christians in interfaith endeavours. The religious studies scholar Graham Harvey noted that the popular and prevalent media image of Wicca is mostly inaccurate. Pearson similarly noted that popularity and media perceptions of Wicca have often been misleading. In the United States, a number of legal decisions have improved and validated the status of Wiccans, especially Detmer v. Landon in 1986. However, Wiccans have encountered opposition from some politicians and Christian organizations, including former President of the United States George W. Bush, who stated that he did not believe Wicca to be a religion. In 2007, the United States Department of Veteran Affairs, after years of dispute, added the pentagram to the list of emblems of belief that can be included on government-issued markers, headstones and plaques honouring deceased veterans. In Canada, Dr. Heather Botting, Lady Aurora, and Dr. Gary Botting, Pan, the original High Priestess and High Priest of Coven Celeste, and founding elders of the Aquarian Tabernacle Church, successfully campaigned the British Columbian government and the federal government in 1995 to allow them to perform recognised Wiccan weddings to become prison and hospital chaplains, and, in the case of Heather Botting, to become the first officially recognised Wiccan chaplain in a public university. Wow. The oath-based system of many Wiccan traditions makes it difficult for outsider scholars to study them. For instance, after the anthropologist Tanya Luhrmann revealed information about what she learned as an initiate of a Wiccan coven in her academic study, various Wiccans were upset, believing that she had broken the oaths of secrecy taken at initiation. This was an extremely interesting read for many reasons, really. I feel like I know a lot more about it, and concerning the just the end there when they talk about, Wiccans' rights, of course, to be a chaplain, to marry people, stuff like that. It will always be a legal battle for a new subset to be able to get those rights first, but I think it should exist. I think there should be a legal battle, really, when a new group wants a right like that, because I think something like a chaplain or a wedding ceremony should have, some level of, eliteness, or kind of honour imbued in it. And I think that means that the groups who do go through all the hoops and, meet with the government and stuff and manage to get their religion, able to marry people and stuff like that, I think it actually imbues them with more of an honour once they're able to do it than if we gave any small, kind of group of people the ability to do it. Now, concerning all the statistics, if any of them are true, if there are hundreds of thousands, that is definitely a sizable portion of the world's population, and they definitely should have those rights if hundreds of thousands of people practice, and if many people do truly take it seriously. It's new and prevailing religions like this and groups which I find extremely interesting when you start talking about what rights they should have. Because take Jediism or the Church of Jedi, for example. When it first started out, if there were only like 100 people doing it, and it could have splintered away, and it wasn't very popular, then, and it's just fans of the Star Wars franchise, then I don't think they should be given the right to do something like that. Because of course there's a lot of legal ramifications and stuff. But since, the Church of Jedi, or the Jediism has grown as a religion, of course now you can a Jedi marriage and stuff like that. And it's not only fans of the Star Wars franchise, but also of the collective belief of Jediism and their core tenets and everything like that. So I find these new prevailing belief systems and stuff that emerge super interesting. So if you would like me to read about Jediism, which I'm personally interested in reading about, please leave a comment and tell me to read about it. Thank you so much for following me. I know that this has been a long series. Most of them are not going to be this long, but this is a very detailed subject, learning about a whole religion, you know. And I think it's very important to learn about things like this, because you're learning about something which is really core to someone's heart. And even if you don't agree, or you think it's silly maybe perhaps, or you think maybe it's even dangerous, or you disagree with it, it's always important to seek knowledge first,